Hello everyone, welcome again in Eng-Man YouTube channel. So again, we will continue our quick knowledge series and we will talk about barriers and buffers. So let's get into the business. All right, so I have this material. I get this material from the source. This is a very good, interesting read, Oilfield Production Geology. Again, we will talk about barriers and buffers. First, I'm going to direct you to check this picture. The first one we have is barrier to vertical flow. We have wells. Of course, we have the reservoir. And then you see here the gray area, the gray zone, the gray layer. We call that barrier to vertical flow. And we can see that it is continuous. And down there, we have another picture. Again, the gray layer, but they are disconnected. They are not continuous. And we call this thing baffles. All right, so barrier to vertical flow, baffles to vertical flow. They will hinder vertical flow, but they are different. One is more continuous, one is more disconnected. Okay, so now we can read these bullet points together. This is very important, and again, it's quick. All right, so you can read it with me. Non-reservoir rock, such as shales, coals, cemented intervals, micritic carbonates, and bedded anhydrites. All of them can act as extensive barriers, continuous, or baffles to vertical flow within a reservoir. All right, so the first important thing is that non-reservoir rock, which are tight, they can act as barrier and baffles. The examples are shales, coals, cemented intervals. All right, so remember that. Micritic carbonates and anhydrites. Okay, so remember that they are the non-reservoir rock that can act as barriers or buffers. Now we can see the difference here. Barriers are laterally extensive and prevent flow communication vertically. So laterally extensive, or in other words, it's continuous. Whereas buffers are short ranging and can impede vertical flow but will not prevent it. So the difference between preventing and impeding, difference between barriers and buffers. So buffers are disconnected, they are short ranging, they can impede the vertical flow, but they will not prevent it. So you need to see the difference, you need to understand the difference, and you need to know and characterize your reservoir. Does your reservoir has barrier, tend to have barrier or buffers? Okay, again, read it with me. Shales are the major features causing flow layering in reservoirs. So the biggest guy here, shales, problematic. The areal extent of shales within a reservoir is generally related to the depositional environment. This is a very important statement. So now, especially if you're engineers, reservoir engineers or production engineers, you know that your reservoir have sort of barriers or buffers that can somehow slower down the vertical flow, slower down the water coning, something like that. Then you need to ask your geologist friend or petrophysicist friends because they are the ones who are the expert in this. Knowing the depositional environment and connected with either you have barrier or buffers. To the third bullet point here. Shale barriers are more extensive, we know that, but it is more extensive in marine sediments than they are in continental sediments. So marine sediments versus continental sediments. When we are talking about marine, we are talking about sea. Okay, so long story short, we have more shales, more extensive shale in sea reservoir or marine sediments. Shales in deep water sediments commonly act as flow barriers. Shales are less widespread in fluvial channel systems and deltas. So fluvial means river. Okay, so we have more shales, more extensive shale, more continuous, more widespread in marine sediments, deep water sediments, but they are less spread in fluvial channel or deltas. So if you have fluvial reservoir or deltaic reservoir, then sort of a good news for you. You are the lucky guy here. Okay. Hopefully the performance of your reservoir is good compared to if you have, or actually, no, it's actually the other way around. Okay. Sometimes, barrier and baffles is good because it can hinder the water production. It can slower down the water productions. So, yep, I take my word. So if you have fluvial reservoir and delta reservoir, then we cannot directly say it is good or bad. Okay. The main point is that barrier and baffle will slower down the vertical flow. Okay. Discontinuous cells act as baffles to vertical flow. We already know that. Okay. Discontinuous shell act as baffle to vertical flow. Discontinuous means baffle. For fluid to move upward in baffled reservoir like this, it has to take a tortuous route around the edges of the shell baffles. This situation can sometimes be favorable to production. Why? Because of course, usually we have water, more water here. Okay, more water there. And suppose we have perforation here. It's a good thing to have baffle here because when the water rises and wants to reach the perforation, it cannot go directly to that way to reach the perforation. Cannot. It must take the tortuous path around the edges of the shell until finally it reaches the perforation. So it is more complicated for the flow, it is more tortuous, it takes longer time for the water to finally reach the producer. So it's actually a good thing. All right. So yeah, actually barrier and baffle in this point of view is good, but sometimes barriers and baffles can also, you know, decrease the potential, decrease the productivity, especially if you have too many shells here and there. Okay. For example, a rising oil-water contact will be obstructed by a series of discontinuous shells in a reservoir unit. So if you have rising oil-water contact, they will rise. At the end of the day, it will reach your perforation. But if they meet or obstructed by series of discontinuous shell, then it will take longer time for the water to finally reach the perforation. All right, the water will be forced to flow along a longer and more tortuous path through the reservoir, taking more time to reach the basal perforations in a production well and coming in contact with more oil. Okay, so along the way, the water will rise, but it takes more time, it takes a longer and more tortuous path. And along the way, it's a good news, it's another good news, it will come into contact with more oil. So in the process, the water in those tortuous paths, they will push, they will sweep the oil, which will later on increase the oil production, or you can say improve the sweep efficiency. So that's another take point. That's another good news of having baffles or barrier to flow. Okay. And lastly, oil production from the well will be water free for a for a longer period of time than would be the case if the shale baffles were not present. Okay. So if let's say in imagination, we don't see or we don't have this Baffles. Okay, we do not have hindrance in vertical flow, then water will eventually coning up and reach the perforation. So either the perforation will come or will meet the rising oil water contact, or you will basically have water conning problem. So both the problems will give you faster or will give you water production, either rising water contact, rising water oil contact that reaches the perforation, or water conning that finally reaches the perforation. Both of them, without hindrance to vertical flow, will give you water production, which is not very good for us. Okay, so I think that's all. I hope you enjoy this video. I hope this video is useful. Thank you so much for watching and see you again in the next quick knowledge videos. Thank you.